How Japan's soldiers were treated after the war was lost. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. On August 15th, 1945, the people of Japan heard something they had never heard before, the voice of their emperor, speaking not of victory, but of surrender. For millions, the war ended in that moment. But for the men who had fought it, the consequences were only beginning. They returned not as conquerors, and not even as survivors in the usual sense. They came back to a country shattered by defeat, occupation, and shame. The ideals they had been raised on no longer existed. The honor they believed they carried no longer had meaning. This is not a story about battles or strategy. It is a story about what happens after a war ends, when soldiers lay down their weapons and discover that peace can be just as unforgiving. Because the fate of Japan's soldiers after World War II reveals something deeper about defeat, responsibility, and how societies decide who deserves compassion and who does not. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in August 1945, the war ended in theory, but not in experience. Across Asia and the Pacific, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers were scattered, isolated, and unsure whether the message even applied to them. Many were cut off from communication, surrounded by former enemies, or still following orders issued months earlier. For these men, peace did not arrive all at once. It arrived slowly, unevenly, and often painfully. For those who did hear the emperor's words, the reaction was conflicted. Relief existed, but so did disbelief and shame. Imperial ideology had taught that defeat was dishonor and that surrender was unthinkable. Many soldiers had been conditioned to believe that returning alive after losing a war was a personal failure. The end of fighting did not bring clarity. It brought uncertainty. When veterans finally returned home, they encountered a country transformed. Japan was no longer sovereign. American forces occupied the nation, rewriting its political system and dismantling its military institutions. Symbols of imperial power disappeared almost overnight. The society these soldiers had left behind no longer existed. Many expected recognition or understanding. Instead, they found distance, civilians, struggling with shortages, destroyed cities, and an uncertain future, often viewed returning soldiers with discomfort. They were reminders of a war that had brought devastation rather than glory. Defeat carried stigma, and that stigma settled heavily on those who had fought. The new government, operating under occupation oversight, offered limited support. Returning soldiers were processed quickly and efficiently, but without ceremony. They were housed temporarily, issued basic supplies, and sent on their way. Foreign currency earned or taken during the war was confiscated. In exchange, veterans received devalued yen, ration cards, and train tickets back to hometowns that often offered little opportunity. Physical injuries were common. Missing limbs, chronic illness, and lasting pain shaped daily life for many veterans. But psychological wounds were just as widespread. Years of combat, loss, and survival had left deep internal scars. Yet there was little space in post-war Japan to acknowledge trauma. Silence became the expected response, both socially and personally. Finding work proved difficult. Military service, once celebrated, now carried little value. Some veterans found employment in reconstruction projects, clearing debris, rebuilding roads, and restoring infrastructure. These jobs were demanding and poorly paid, but they offered a way to contribute to a society focused entirely on rebuilding and moving forward. Not all soldiers returned home quickly. Tens of thousands captured by Soviet forces faced a far harsher fate. Transported north into Siberia, they entered a world defined by extreme climate and forced labor. Possessions were taken. Living conditions were severe. Survival depended on endurance rather than rank or ideology. These men were put to work repairing infrastructure, cutting timber, and supporting Soviet reconstruction. Winters were brutal. Food was limited. Many did not survive captivity. Those who eventually returned to Japan often did so years later, weakened and changed, to a country that had already moved on without them. When they arrived, their reintegration was no easier. Their absence had erased them from community memory. Their experiences did not fit neatly into the emerging narrative of recovery and peace. Once again, silence greeted them. At the same time, Japan was undergoing a public reckoning. Trials were held for senior political and military leaders. Responsibility for the war was formally addressed, but unevenly. High-ranking officials stood before international tribunals, while the emperor remained largely untouched. For ordinary soldiers, this created a profound sense of dislocation. They had followed orders, endured hardship, and suffered defeat. Yet accountability seemed to stop above them, while judgment lingered below them. They were neither fully blamed nor fully absolved, simply left behind. As the years passed, Japan rebuilt with remarkable speed. Industry expanded. Cities were reconstructed. A new national identity began to form, centered on peace and economic growth. For many veterans, this transformation deepened their sense of isolation. The values they had been taught no longer applied, and the society around them had little interest in revisiting the past. Some veterans found stability through family and work. Others struggled quietly with memories and loss. Many avoided speaking about the war altogether, not because they had forgotten, but because they sensed that no one wanted to listen. Their story reveals something essential about defeat. Victory is often wrapped in ceremony and meaning. Defeat is managed through distance. Societies eager to rebuild often choose silence over reflection, forward movement over reckoning. Japanese veterans became living reminders of a past the nation wanted to leave behind. Remembering them meant confronting uncomfortable questions about obedience, responsibility, and the cost of unquestioned loyalty. Over time, public attitudes softened. Memorials were built. Testimonies were recorded. The experiences of veterans slowly entered historical discussion. But for many, recognition arrived late, after lives had already been shaped by years of neglect. Their post-war existence was defined not by the moment of surrender, but by what followed, by the struggle to adapt to peace after being formed by war, by the challenge of finding purpose in a society that no longer knew what to do with them. The fate of Japan's soldiers after World War II reminds us that wars do not end cleanly. They leave behind people whose lives continue long after treaties are signed. And those lives often carry the quiet, unresolved weight of history. The story of Japan's soldiers after World War II is not about blame alone. It is about aftermath. It shows us that when wars end, consequences do not stop at ceasefires or treaties. They continue in the lives of those who must return to societies changed beyond recognition. These men were shaped by a system that demanded loyalty and sacrifice, and then collapsed. What followed was not honor or understanding, but silence. Their experience forces us to ask difficult questions about responsibility and memory, about how nations decide who carries the weight of defeat and who is allowed to move on. Because history is not only written by victors, it is also carried by those who survive and must learn how to live in a world that no longer knows what to do with them.